Good morning. I'd like to welcome you back to our Bible study. This is Friday morning, and you may be seeing it on a Tuesday evening. I don't know. But one of the things that I want to share with you is that our lesson today is probably kind of mysterious, not something that you would necessarily be familiar with, but it is Leviticus 25, 1 through 13. As I said the last time we were together, I'd given sort of a general introduction to Leviticus, not the most exciting book in our Bible. And of course, in our world today, there are many people who don't think there is an exciting book of the Bible, except for possibly Ezekiel and Revelation, and that they're excited about those books probably for the wrong reasons. But anyway, Leviticus is basically giving instructions to the Aaronic priesthood and the Levitical priesthood about how to do sacrifices in the temple, how to sacrifice the animals, what prayers to say, talks about the various vestments that they would wear. We talk about the use of hours and days, and a lot of other sort of what we would call legalistic mumbo jumbo. If you like the law, Leviticus is a great place for you. Most people don't like to read the fine print, but really the book of Leviticus is kind of the fine print of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. This text for us today is probably a little bit more pertinent. It ties in with sort of land use, or you could even say ecology, and it's a very rare thing in the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, to hear or see or read something about human beings, in this case the Israelites' relationship with the land. But as you know, the land was very, very important to Israel. It was given to Israel as a gift by God, as a sign of the covenant. God promised to make Israel's name great, promised to give them land. And so this is one of the promises that God makes to Israel. And so for this reason, this idea of land use is very important. So we get to Leviticus 25, 1 through 13, and we see again, as we do throughout the book of Leviticus, that the Lord is speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai. This would indicate that this probably happens in the second year of Israel's wilderness wanderings in the desert or in the wilderness. They spent just about a year, according to putting various timelines together from the Pentateuch. The Israelites spent about a year camping at the bottom of Mount Sinai. When my son and I were going through the Suez Canal earlier this year in January, we could see the range of mountains where Mount Sinai, sometimes called Mount Horeb, was. And it was kind of exciting for me to see the place where, in theory, Moses went up and talked to God face to face. So the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, once a year, once you enter the land that I am giving you, the land must celebrate a Sabbath rest to the Lord." What's interesting here is it's not just people that celebrate the Sabbath or observe the Sabbath. It's also all of creation. You remember the creation story from Genesis 1 and 2, how God created it on 6 days, and then God rested on the seventh day. And so God recommends to each of us a Sabbath day of rest. And that's why Sabbath, until our modern time, after really World War II, about the time I was born in 1952, people started shying away from the Sabbath as a day of religious observance or rest or remembrance. Those are the things that we use the Sabbath for. Nowadays, people work 7 days a week and so forth. But originally conceived, the Israelites said and wrote into their laws something like this: if the Sabbath is good enough for God, then the Sabbath should be good enough for us. And so, by extension, not only is the Sabbath good for people, it's good for their animals. And here we see one of three places in the Pentateuch where it talks about people's relationship with the land. And in this particular case, Leviticus 25, we see the idea of implementing Sabbath for soil, ground, acreage. For the next thing that it says, the land must celebrate a Sabbath rest and do so to the Lord. So that it's not just a practical matter, but it's also has a religious intent behind it. The land will rest, the land will lie fallow, and to do so is to do so to the Lord. And so as it's resting, the land and the people who care for the land, as it rests, it's always a reminder that they do this because of God and God's provisions for them. And then it tells us specifically, you will plant your fields for 6 years and prune your vineyards and gather their crops for 6 years. And so we're on this 7-year cycle, just like in creation we had a 7-day cycle. And on the first 6, we produce, we work, we labor, the land labors. We do that. And then in verse 4 it says, but in the 7th year, like on the 7th day God rested, but in the 7th year the land will have a special Sabbath rest. Okay? Special Sabbath, not just a rest, but a special Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. There's the reminder again. We do this for a religious or for a faith purpose. And then here is the directive. You must not plant your fields or prune your vineyards. You must not harvest the secondary growth of your produce or gather the grapes of your freely growing vines. This means that on that 7th year, nobody lifts a finger to toil in the soil. Originally, in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, we are told that human beings were created to till and keep the garden or till and keep the soil. But here, they allow the soil to have a rest, to lie fallow. And as we know from pre-Civil War days, especially in the South, that you can grow one crop too often and too much. Tobacco was grown from Virginia all the way to Texas, and what happened in some places was the land was over-cultivated. Originally, it was rich soil and produced a lot, but over the years, people over-cultivated, and what ended up happening is the crops became more and more anemic as things wore on. So, you shall not harvest the secondary growth of your product or your produce. And what that means is you don't want to over-cultivate. My daughter the other day was talking with me and said that they had had so much rain and prosperity in terms of crops that the guy that she buys hay from was getting ready to get a third cutting of hay for cows or horses to last over the winter. Well, in Texas, generally, if somebody gets a second cutting off of a piece of land, they're pretty fortunate. But to get a third cutting is almost unheard of, at least in my experience. And so, what this provision in Leviticus 25 is saying is don't overuse your land. Uh, and this could be a good principle for a lot of different things. Sometimes in churches, we over subscribe people, and sometimes you get the same people doing the same jobs over and over and over again. This is for two reasons. Sometimes there are people that are too overeager to be in leadership positions, but probably more often is that we cannot find people to do certain jobs. They are either afraid to do the jobs or afraid of overcommitting themselves. For whatever reason, they will not do it. Well, the land is the same way. As long as people keep cultivating it, keep plowing it up, keep planting seeds in it without any stoppage, it will eventually run down the land, and all the nutrients that are in the soil will be used up. So that's one thing. And the other one is the vineyards. The same principle applies to the vineyards. So year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are years that you cultivate as much as you can. And then in the 7th year, you just leave everything alone. And naturally, there will be an excess that comes up out of the soil. We've all driven by a big field of beans, for example, and you will notice that in the middle of the fields there are all these stalks of corn that are far taller, and you can see them easily from the highway. Well, that is a case where the year before, the year before, the year before, corn had been planted there, and then they planted beans as some sort of crop rotation, but the residual corn that was in that particular piece of land will sprout and bloom, and that's how we can tell what was there before. So the law here says, do not plant in the 7th year. Let everything be as it is, but you can eat whatever produce pops up on that land in a, I guess you could say, natural way. And then it says, it will be a year of special rest for the land. Whatever the land produces during its Sabbath will be your food. That's what I'm talking about, the residual that comes up that had been planted from years before. And it's for you, and they're speaking here to landowners or farmers in Israel, for your male and female servants, and for your hired laborers and foreign guests who live with you. That is, people have servants, people have hired laborers, which are like the day laborers that you would see in the Matthew 25 parable about the laborers in the vineyard, where some are hired at 6 in the morning and 9 and 12 and 3 and 5, and they're all paid the same. That is what that's what this is referring to. And then foreign guests would be something like resident aliens. They're people that are from foreign countries that are like migrant workers. They just work from field to field to field. We have that situation in Texas a lot, where migrant workers will work the harvest, and sometimes they'll start in the south and they'll go all the way to the north to Amarillo. So these are people that live with them. They will be fed from this residual crop that happened in the 5th and 6th year that grow into the 7th, as well as for the livestock, the wild animals in your land. All of the land's produce can be eaten. So the provision to let the land rest is one thing, but there's the practical matter of feeding people, and the way that they do that is the residual crops that come up in the year that the land is laying fallow or having its Sabbath. Now, there's a slight shift of gears in verse 8, and it says, count off 7 weeks of years, that is 7 times 7, so that the 7 weeks of years totals 49 years. And so every 49 years, or the 50th year, the numbers get a little confusing. Is the Sabbath Jubilee year, is it in the 49th year, or is it in the actual 50th year, or are there two adjacent Jubilee years that come back to back? It's hard to say. My guess is it's in the 49th year, where that would be a Sabbath year. The Sabbath years would be 7, 14, 21, and so forth. So then have the trumpet blown on the 10th day of the 7th month of that Jubilee year. And that trumpet Israel would use, and they called it a shofar, which is a ram's horn. They would blow that, in other words, in a ritual way. Everyone would know that the 49th year had arrived, but they'd blow it in a ritual way, the way that we ring the bell to start worship, or something of that nature. When the trumpet is blown throughout the land on the day of reconciliation, and that is one of the feast days for Israel, you will make the 50th year holy, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all the inhabitants. And this freedom throughout the land is freedom from several things. And this may be disturbing for some, what I am about to say, but he says it will be a jubilee year for you. Each of you must return to your family property and to your extended family. Now, the jubilee year was an ideal, and whether it was practiced or not in Israel is up to some debate. Must have been practiced to a certain extent, because we see it referred to throughout the Bible in, a few minor places. But the idea of Jubilee was simply this. People sometimes, for reasons of debt or some other circumstance, would have their land taken away from them, their family inheritance. And so every 50 years, everything reverted back to how it was 50 years before. So if your family had lost the family farm, for example, after 50 years, you would get it back and you would start over. It's sort of like rebooting a computer. You just start over from year one. Well, this deeply disturbs capitalist people like us. We say, look, I got what I got fair and square. Nobody can take it away from me. Even if you actually cheated people out of money or land or anything else like that, you will always say, I earned this fair and square. And so the Jubilee year just would be kind of a total economic disaster for us. So we need to remember that Israel, number one, had a very, very simple, ancient economy. And so to reboot all the property and debt and so forth would be something that would not be nearly as complicated as we would imagine it today. We think that this is unfair, but the intent behind it was something that we have issues with today. In ancient times, like modern day, the rich get richer and the poor get poor. And one of the reasons that people kept Sabbath was because on the Sabbath day, there was no commerce. And so the rich stayed where they were before the Sabbath started and pick up where they were economically. They didn't get any richer over the Sabbath day, and the poor didn't get any poorer. Now during the week, hey, it's dog eat dog. But in that particular day, the intent of Israel was to help even the economic score, because the more equal people are, in Israel's thinking, was the more equitable a community or a society could be. One time Dr. Walter Brueggemann was talking about Jubilee year with a church group, and there was a lady there, and she said, Dr. Brueggemann, is there any actual proof that they practiced the Jubilee year in Israel? And Dr. Brueggemann said, well, ma'am, I have to tell you, the Bible is full of things that people have never actually practiced. And maybe that is the case. But the intent to keep everybody relatively equal in property and wealth, every 50 years sort of recalibrating the economy, was done to make sure that there weren't super rich people and super poor people, but that all people had equal footing in the case of economic development and survival. And so the last verses say this: the 50th year will be a jubilee year for you, and you do not plant, you do not harvest secondary growth, you do not gather from the freely growing vines, because it is jubilee. It will be holy to you. So what this means is the jubilee year is a year that is set apart from the other years. The people, as holy people to God, are set apart from the common cultures around them, and the priesthood is set apart from Israel to lead the people in worship and in sacrifice. And then it says you can only eat the produce directly out of the field. Each of you must return to your family property in this Jubilee year, and that is the property is restored to people. One other thing about the Jubilee year that I think bears speaking to is that in the Jubilee year, everyone who has become a slave, and the word in the CEB is servant, but the word is doulos in Greek, and it means slave. Every 50 years, all slaves, whether economic or from war or whatever, were released. And we will see the phrase release of the captives in the New Testament from time to time. And what that's talking about is freedom that is granted to people who are indentured servants or slaves of some sort or another. Well, I thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Our text next week is in the book of Deuteronomy. I can't remember what the number is, but just read all of Deuteronomy if you'd like. Okay, thank you very much.